John and I, we used to laugh about how we actually met for the first time. It was in John's office at the sheriff's department. At that time, I was just a cub reporter, I guess you'd say, and part of my beat was to pick up the police reports and stuff every morning for the blotter.
Mm-hmm.
And so, any rate, the Morris case broke, and there was a story about it in the Indianapolis Star, which was the Indianapolis paper. It's about 30 miles from Greenfield.
Mm-hmm.
And after that story ran about this girl's disappearance, there was also apparently the paper in Franklin, Indiana, which is about 30 miles south of Indianapolis, had picked it up, and they had written some headline about some truck driver that claimed he'd seen Lora Morris, claimed he'd seen this gal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at any rate, I was totally pissed off at John because I read the Indianapolis Star story, and that he was the detective on it, and I was totally pissed that he had given it to the Indianapolis paper before giving it to us, the local paper.
Yeah.
And John was totally pissed at newspapers, period, because of this headline in the Franklin paper, which was in fact, misleading. There's no question about it. It ended up the guy, well, he just saw somebody he thought maybe kind of looked like her, and and we ended up in his office on both of us standing on both sides of his desk, yelling and pointing our fingers at each other. About just mad as hell, both of us. And at any rate, make a long story short, that's how we actually first met and became probably best friends for a number of years.
Now, so related to that specific trucker thing, what happened to, I did read a blog online that mentioned that briefly, but I hadn't seen that particular article, and it was one of the few things I hadn't, because I have a newspapers.com subscription, so I tracked online a lot of the old stuff, but that one that it talked about the trucker was pulled out of thin air to me, so I didn't know what it was. So basically, some trucker had thought that they had
some truck driver had seen somebody, it's like, it's like, the police call, ask for tips on something, and they get 5,000 of them.
Right.
And only maybe one turns out to be for real.
Yeah.
This was some truck driver who had seen the story in the Star, and then he called apparently the Franklin Daily Journal, and said that, well, he saw somebody that could have been her, blah 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 blah, heading south or heading somewhere. Well, and of course they run the headline, "Trucker IDs Lora Morris."
Oh.
Well, no, he didn't ID her. What he did was said he saw somebody that could have been her, basically.
And then, but that blog post went on to say that Munden went to find him out of state and to make him retract the story. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Huh.
That he went to find him out of state. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I don't think John ever made a trip to talk to that trucker.
Okay.
He may have tried to track him down through the company he worked for and called and talked to him. That wouldn't shock me.
Okay.
But I don't ever remember him making a trip. He was just really pissed at the Daily Journal.
Gotcha.
And of course, there I am trying to explain, look, I realize the headline isn't great, but, people need to read the whole story and not just read the headline. Well, goddamn it, this is going to make people, they're going to quit looking because they think she's been seen. Well, by the way, how come the damn Indianapolis Star got this story, and when I'm here every day and nobody told, one of those.
And it's funny, I like both of you had a point. I mean, his point is perfectly taken. If you're a detective and you're trying to keep people looking at this, and that
Sure.
and there people are saying, oh no, she just up and left, that's a good reason for everyone to ignore it. That's a good reason.
Oh, absolutely.
Dave Scott was a staff writer for the Greenfield Daily Reporter when Lora Morris went missing, and he spent countless hours working with John Munden on her case over the years. Because John Munden is deceased and I couldn't access his vast personal knowledge of the case, The next best thing was speaking to Dave Scott.
You can't imagine, Jeni, how many hours we all spent on this over that period of years. And like I say, we had what we called the Lora Morris Study Group. And, that was John and I and the prosecutor from here and a detective from the state police and a couple of other players who came and went, going over every possible theory and every possible fact as best you could determine, and even every tidbit of hearsay, trying to find. Our belief was always, well, there's only going to be one theory that fits it all.
And did you guys come to a consensus on what the theory was?
Pretty much, yeah.
It was that Trudy killed Lora, and then everything that happened afterward, except for Chuck, was Steve?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to know where you guys landed.
Yeah, that would have been the case we would have made in the last chapter of our book had we finished that. That Trudy killed her daughter, probably in a fight. Probably Lora threatening to leave, or threatened to go back to Chuck, or go back to Bryce, or that she wasn't going to Florida, or whatever, and they got into an argument. I can see Lora, because her mom was bigger and had beat her before. I can see Lora grabbing a kitchen knife or something like that and threatening her, and I can see it getting more and more heated and more and more heated, and finally Trudy, we know, kept that 25 in her tucked in her bra all the time. That she probably pulled that pistol out, not necessarily with the intention of killing her, but with the intention of either creating a standoff with Lora, who may have been armed with a knife or a club or something else, or just to threaten her. And in the heat of the moment, either through a physical confrontation or just nervousness over the whole deal, the gun went off somehow, and Lora was killed. And then she panicked, called her dad. Her dad makes an emergency trip from Ohio to Greenfield, doesn't take the nurse, drops the nurse off so she can't be a witness to anything, is gone long enough to help Trudy get rid of the body, so to speak, and goes back and picks up the nurse and beats the hell for Florida.
Wasn't he old then, though, Lawrence Romans? Wasn't he like 80s? Or?
Well, he was up there, but that, I don't know that necessarily meant he couldn't have helped her.
And it was just the two of them. There was no one else he had brought down?
Well, as far as we know.
Okay.
As far as we know, it was just the two of them. And the time frame would have given them a couple of hours to have done that before she ever contacted the police.
How far away was where they were in Ohio from where...
it wasn't that far. I don't know.
You guys drove it. You drove it.
15 minutes. I don't recall exactly.
So it was then. It was doable for sure in an hour or something.
Yeah, I remember the trip we made over there. John ran out of gas.
I heard that from Danny. He didn't tell me much, but he laughed when he said that you guys had to push the car or something.
He ran out of gas right at the entrance to an off ramp.
Oh my gosh! So you had to push it down the off ramp.
And so we pushed the car up the off ramp and to a gas station.
Oh my!
We never let John forget that.
That's funny.
It was
wow.
But I guess I'm saying an hour and a half at tops. It's only 50 mile from Greenfield to the Ohio line.
I guess I thought it was, I don't know why I thought it was not doable, but yeah, that definitely is doable. So we've got, just like with Bryce, it's a doable situation, whether, I get it now. So basically what you're saying is that's the theory you landed on. That's how you would have ended the book, because after looking at everything, you thought that was the most plausible scenario, all of you collectively.
Absolutely. I think absolutely we all agreed that as bizarre as it sounded, that nothing you could take one of them and explain certain ones, but they didn't fit with the other crimes, the other murders or whatever. And you could take this one and say, well, that explains this and this, but it doesn't explain these because there's no connection that we can tell. And this does, so by the time you put it all together, that's just something happened down in Florida the night Trudy disappeared.
Right.
Something happened there, and she left her purse. Brenda found her purse and her clothes. There was no clothes. Maybe Steve tried to say she'd run off and she had some black boyfriend in
all that
Miami
stuff's in
or
the
somewhere.
Isn't the report? And it's they even there was even a name, and they tracked the guy down, and they didn't know anything about it. I mean, it was all a crazy story for sure.
Yeah, of course. and I think he told different stories to different people.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
So something happened that night. There had to been some kind of confrontation. Why was there? That's the what's the motive for the confrontation?
Yeah, that was my thing. When did Steve turn from thinking, because here's the thing, all the way down to McCullough, when that whole Soldier of Fortune magazine, the hit on him happened, that was years later. So that should have been out of Steve's mind. I mean, by then, why was Steve going after someone? To me, that says he's still thinking it's someone related to him. Yeah. And then when did his mind change to Trudy? What made him set his sights on Trudy? She did it.
That's exactly right. And he had not only murdered one person, maybe more, in his quest to find this. He spent ungodly amounts of money hiring private detectives and paying for, I wouldn't be surprised if Steve didn't pay for the testing that they did on that audio tape. Steve was just throwing money at everything he could throw money at.
Well, he gave Munden that bag of cash too, and Munden took that and used it, apparently, that whole bag of cash to surveil people.
There was more than one time, though, when there was cash in a bag.
You're kidding.
No, not having to do with John, other than, Steve gave him some money one time to pay expenses for various stuff that the department would not fund. The case had become so old at that point. You know what I mean? That there was.
Oh, I see.
They weren't willing to pay for trips to here or trips to there and this and that and the other. And Steve gave him some cash at one point to pay for expenses for stuff like that. But there was before Steve went to New Orleans to confront Tony Lambert.
Mm-hmm.
He showed John a bag and claimed and opened it up, and it was full of cash, and claimed there was $100,000, I think, in there, and that he was gonna try to pay him off or bribe him or do something or beat it out of him or whatever he had to do to find out if Tony had anything to do with his daughter's disappearance, almost like there was a ransom demand. But so yeah, I guess my point is, if he had already murdered at least one person wrongly and had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and 10 years trying to figure out who was after him and who had killed his daughter and all that, and then all of a sudden your wife tells you she did it.
Well, is that what you think happened?
Yeah.
His wife did?
Yeah.
You don't think that John Munden shared that theory with him?
Shared what theory with him?
That he thought, John clearly by that time thought it was Trudy that did it. You don't think that he shared that theory with Steve?
By that time, I would be surprised, because I think by that time we were convinced that he had, in fact, been responsible for Lambert's death. And, can I say 100% that he didn't? No, I can't. But I would find that harder to believe. I think they ended up in some kind of deal, and somehow it came to a head down there, and Trudy confessed to it. I think she told him. And he just was so enraged that he killed her.
What happened in Florida in the summer of 1986 is another one of the many mysteries of this case. Nobody that I have spoken to seems to have a good handle on what it was that triggered Trudy Snedeker to go missing. Either, as Dave Scott said, Steve Snedeker found out something that led him to believe Trudy had killed their daughter, or he had other reasons, personal reasons, for wanting his wife dead. As far as I'm concerned, both of those are equally possible when you're talking about Steve Snedeker. But if you go with the theory that he killed Trudy because he believed that she had killed their daughter, I think it's less likely that Trudy herself would come clean with that information. I think it's more likely that he got that information from John Munden. But then we have to consider the alternate universe where this case resides, and you have to ask yourself, if Trudy didn't do it, then obviously she didn't confess to it, right? So you're back to square one. Why did Steve kill his wife, if it was not related to the death of his daughter? And I have to say at this point, I'm not convinced Trudy Snedeker killed her daughter. So I think Steve Snedeker either got a whiff of John Munden's theory, or he killed his wife for reasons that were unrelated to his daughter's death. And I gotta say, if that was the case, that would be the biggest tragedy of this whole situation. Trudy Snedeker losing her life because her husband was led to believe that his wife killed her daughter.
We found out that primarily Trudy's purpose, Lora had been, the family ran a waste oil business in Greenfield.
Right.
Okay. Which was, through subsequent conversations with drivers and various other places for him, was a total scam. Steve would he had trucks, and he would take these tanker trucks up to industrial sites in nearby cities or whatever, and charge them X $100 to take their waste oil, their contaminated waste oil. And at least one driver told him that, well, all we did was we drove it out in the country and spread it on the roads.
Oh, God.
You know, there were other guys who said, well, I used to run some for Steve, and we would go and to X company, and they'd pay us a big bunch of money to take their waste oil, and we would turn around and drive it to the next city and sell it as fuel for boilers to another company. We didn't give a shit that it was contaminated.
Oh, God.
You know, and so they were getting paid both ends.
Right. Yeah.
And all they were doing was driving it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, Steve was definitely involved in some shady stuff. Well, at any rate, Lora had been the bookkeeper for the company.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so she would have known all the records and all the ins and outs and all the shady dealings that her mom and dad were up to. Well, when they moved to Florida, Lora didn't go. She didn't want to go. Her daughter was here. She kept thinking she'd get back with Bryce. And so she stayed in and around Greenfield. Well, it appears that Trudy's sole purpose for coming up here that night, they had tried to get her to go down to Florida with them, and she wouldn't go. And Trudy, apparently, her job was to come up here and convince Lora one way or the other to go to Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that potential issue,
Right.
that they were afraid she somehow would spill the beans and get them in trouble and all that kind of stuff. But they were very insistent. And apparently there was no love lost between Trudy and Lora, because there was I think, and it may have been Danny, or it may have been his wife, Laura's sister,
Brenda,
thank you, who recalled something that happened one morning at breakfast when they were living in Greenfield, and Trudy Lora must have said something, and Trudy ended up backhanding her and knocking her out of the chair, and ended up sitting on top of her, beating her in the face.
Oh my gosh.
So Lora was kind of the black sheep. She was not thought of in the same way as the boys. And Trudy could be violent, and Trudy had beaten up on Lora before.
Mm-hmm.
Steve had, as a neighbor claimed that he saw Steve one time with Lora out in the front yard standing on her toes and beating her.
And this is all when she's an adult woman?
Well, apparently during some point during the time that they lived there on Shadeland Drive.
Jeez. Now, Danny told me about, if we're following the timeline here, and so she's missing, they got in an argument, whatever. The next day, Danny told me the night before when they went to, Brenda and Laura went to pick up their mother. They met for dinner at this steakhouse at the mall. They went back to Brenda and Danny's house. He thought maybe there was some issue where Laura did not want to leave. She didn't want to go, probably thinking that they were going to argue. But eventually Trudy won and they left. But before they left, he put one of Trudy's bag in the back of the truck that Laura was driving, which was not hers. It was her father's black truck because hers was having trouble. And he said at that time there was nothing in the back of the truck. But he said when he went to the scene the next day afternoon, by the time he got there, it was like 5:30, that truck was packed full of Laura's belongings and Brandy's belongings. Did you hear that?
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely correct.
So she had to have packed that sometime in the middle of the night.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is absolutely the case. And of course, that was the subject of substantial discussion and debate over the years, as far as, okay, that's a key clue.
Absolutely.
And to be honest with you, my recollection is that even though Danny may have noticed that the next day, I don't know that he said anything about it for a period of time. I have to ask him. I don't know when he did or not. I know he from moment one, he told me when he got there around 5, after there had been a couple hours in between everyone else getting there, the cops being there, he knew something was wrong. He started looking in the thinking maybe she killed herself. She's out in the back, he's checking the woods or whatever and all that. He knew something was wrong. And when he heard Trudy and the police questioning her about, well, there any problems in the family? And Trudy saying no. And he said, well, that's bullshit. So he left and went up there and told Munden, these people are feeding you a line of crap. They're not telling you the truth. Yeah. Well, Danny ended up, let me just give you my recollection. Mm-hmm. Danny ended up being much more help than he appeared to be at the beginning.
Yeah.
He was not much help, as I recall, in the early days of the investigation. As time went on, he gradually kind of came around, and we always wondered, because at first we sort of looked at what Danny said in the same way we were looking at what Trudy and Steve were saying.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Because he's part of the family. Exactly.
Well, trust but verify.
Right.
One of those kind of deals.
Yeah.
But eventually he ended up being quite a bit of help. Mm-hmm. Didn't start out that way in my recollection.
Okay.
You've got to. There's only a couple of things that could have happened, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as John was concerned. The fact that the truck was packed, and it wasn't packed in a traditional packed fashion. It was like the clothes were still in the drawers. The drawers had been pulled out of like a dresser and just set in the back of the truck.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Okay. So it's not like she had been planning this for some extended period of time.
Right.
It's like so I'm going now and I don't have time to do this right. So I'm just going to jerk the drawers out of the dressers and I'm going to set the drawers closing all in the back of the truck. Now, as far as we were concerned, one of two things happened. She either got into it with Trudy and just decided she was going to leave or whatever. Or the other possibility was that she had talked to Bryce, and Bryce said, "Well, yeah, sure, I'm going to come and get you. We'll go up to Goshen and blah 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 blah." Now, we don't believe that's the case because Bryce didn't really want anything to do with her anymore. He had another girlfriend and had sort of moved on. except for obviously the connection with their daughter,
Right.
with Brandy. But she could have thought she was going. She
Yeah.
could have thought she was going up north to Goshen,
Yeah.
or she could have even got into it with Trudy over. Well, I'm going to go back to Bryce. We're going to get back together. No, you're not. You know that son of a bitch is never going to, blah, blah,
Right.
blah, 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 blah. He's no good. He's blah, blah. Yeah, you can
Yep.
see how it escalates.
And as a matter of fact, if you think about her out there packing her stuff, first of all, it explains why she was found in her jean shorts, number one, because she's
Yeah.
outside packing in the middle of the night. Number two, you can even put the Acres/Ab Planet thing in there because they could have come up while she's outside. And she
That's
could have,
true.
you know what I mean? So her
That's true.
being outside and available and doing that, it sort of unfortunately falls into all the theories. It's, you know what I mean? That all of this could be possibilities. And I think that's another reason to show why this case didn't get solved, because there, a lot of these little things could fit into some, multiple theories of what happened.
Absolutely.
So we have Trudy was on the list. Bryce was on the list. Tell me about Bryce as far as what indications that you believed showed that he possibly could have been at that house that night.
Well, there was, of course, Bryce lived in Goshen.
Right.
Okay, which was some distance away from here. I don't know how much you know about the geography of Indiana, but it would have been probably at least a 3-hour drive.
Okay.
From Goshen. At any rate, there was some evidence that they had a phone call between Bryce and Trudy, between Bryce and Lora that night. And we know that their relationship had gotten fairly rocky. I mean, they were divorced, but it was not a friendly divorce as far as that's concerned. I think Bryce, the stories that we always heard was that Bryce had blamed Lora for his brother's death. And
that's something that I've been speaking with Brandy, the daughter, and she pulled up an article for me that showed that he actually died. The actual newspaper article had suggested something else entirely. It was a car accident, but it wasn't like late at night after a party or something. It was a during the day type of incident. A March 7th, 1980 article in the Franklin Daily Journal noted that Robbie Morris, 17, died of massive head injuries at Elkhart General Hospital shortly after his Jeep skidded across the center line of US 20 near Elkhart into the path of another vehicle. He was thrown from the vehicle, and the article says that he was on his way to school when this accident occurred, presumably indicating it happened in the morning. In John Munden's debrief interview in the next episode, you're going to hear his account of being told this story about the death of Bryce Morris's brother, Robbie, by multiple sources.
Well, I don't know. That, like I say, that is... that was the conventional wisdom in the investigation.
Okay, so somebody told that story.
Whatever source that information was, that, and it may have come from it. I mean, I don't know. It could have possibly even come from an interview that John may have done with Bryce himself. Okay. I just, I don't know for sure. I wasn't there for that. But the story, of course, was that the brother had been over to their place and they'd been drinking and this and that and the other, and Bryce wanted his brother to go ahead and spend the night there. Lora threw a fit, didn't want him there, and she created such a row that Bryce basically said, "Man, you're going to have to go." And he ended up then wrecking his car on the way home and dying. And in fact, there were stories that he would go and Bryce would go subsequently and sit for hours on his brother's headstone and talk to him.
Did it seem like when he was sort of banished from the house from Lora, that according to the story, that it could have been morning time, early morning?
I have no idea what time of day it was.
Okay, all right.
I have no idea what time of day it was.
All right.
And normally one would think, well, Bryce should be pretty well alibied because he is so far, from the site. But there was a I can't remember what the guy did, whether he was just a resident or a farmer or somebody. Any rate, as the case went on, there was a fellow who said that he saw a vehicle that matched, generally speaking, Bryce's vehicle, and a young man about his age, just about dawn, parked along a back road. There's a couple of roads here, one that runs along a creek and this and that. That's almost nobody travels. Right. But this guy was I guess he was on his way to work, now that I think about it. And he remembered seeing, and he talked to John about that he had seen a car that matched Bryce's and a young man sitting by himself in it early that morning, about dawn, parked on this really obscure road. And we also know that Bryce did not go into work the next day. Oh,
okay. That's interesting.
Okay. So the point conceivably would have been, and I think there was some, as I recall, despite the fact of the rocky breakup and all this and that, I think Lora always believed, or from what I've been told, always believed that they would someday get back together. Mm-hmm. And Bryce was not having any of it. And that they argued more than once on the phone, of course, and partly about their daughter and partly about their relationship. And anyway, point is, it was just very odd that if he was down here that night, if in fact that was him, you could make a pretty good theory there would have been no other reason for him to be here other than to see Lora.
Right. Yeah.
And if he saw Lora, things could have easily gotten out of hand.
Right. Which seems, no matter what happened, that's what happened. Something got out of hand with Lora Morris, with somebody.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
So, do you remember the make and model of the car, by the way?
No, I don't.
I know that's a stretch, but I figured I'd try. You never know.
Yeah, sure. I wish I could help you, but no, I don't. That's one of those details I'm afraid that was lost with John.
And I may find it.
I want to say it. Uh-huh. Well, no, never mind.
No, go ahead. Tell me.
I want to say it might have been a truck, but I shouldn't say that because that just pulled out of thin air.
Well, I feel like there might have been trucks, and I've got to see what happened is when I got the Florida report, there was a bunch of the Indiana State Police handwritten notes and their handwritten the witness when they were going with John Munden to interview people. So I lucked out on those because Indiana State Police isn't going to release anything on this case. So it just so happens that I got them through Florida. But there, I've been going back and checking the cars mentioned and this and that, and I know that they were mentioning cars related to Al Planop and Akers too, because I did talk to a guy by the name of Bobby Frost, who was one of the people they interviewed about Al Planop, and he had said that David Planop had told him that he had cased the house and that he had parked over by parked essentially like you're talking about somewhere and walked in, and then also Winston, the guy that Lora was seeing, had also mentioned that Al Planop had been in her driveway, just right there, right in the same time frame, for no reason. So but he, according to the witnesses I'm getting a hold of, and I've talked to a few in the friends group now, didn't have a car. So he would have had to have someone else go with him if he wanted to rob the place. But then, as far as what I know about Al Planop, he wasn't the one with the violent record. It was Ricky Akers that had the violent record.
Sure. Al Planop was just more of a small-time crook, I think. You know what I mean? A burglar, a thief. That kind of a thing, a bit of a druggie, as they all were. Right. But nonetheless, I remember, the main thing that sort of brought him up to the front was comments that I heard from John that he had talked to people who said Al Planop was planning on robbing the place.
Right. Yes.
And was much more local than some of the other people, so it would not have been impossible for him to be there and get there and get gone. Right.
And I tracked down some
because the house had been empty for a period of time.
Yes, that's right.
And so it's entirely possible. I mean, should Al Planop have been the guy that he showed up there to break into the place and was surprised that Lora was there.
Well, here's the other thing that interests me about that is Bobby Frost said Abplanep wanted specifically to rob the place while Lora was there. And he said to him, well, let's wear masks and let's go. And he said, why would we do that? We can wait and rob the place when she's hanging out with your wife, Cindy. And David insisted he wanted to do it, according to Frost, when Lora was there. So that I didn't understand, because that seems more like Ricky Akers' MO. He was the rapist, you know?
Yeah. Well, and some of that you are telling me sounds vaguely familiar. The other thing, I guess, that would have struck me a little bit off about that is, there would have had to have been some communication that Lora was home. I mean, it had been, if he went that night and he wanted to do it when she was home, how did he know she was home? I mean, there hadn't been anybody at the house for a long time, and she, because she had an apartment elsewhere.
Right.
Trudy flew up from Florida, and Lora picked her up at the airport, as I recall, and it was just all that, pretty much that night. I mean, I think Lora may have been there off and on, but I don't think she'd been there, on a regular basis.
I'll tell you what. I spoke with Danny, because she had been staying with Danny and Brenda too. And what happened with them is she was staying with Danny and Brenda about 2 weeks before this. And she came home one night, apparently high, and she had Brandy with her. They got upset. They had a talk with her, and she left after that. So she had been staying there about 2 weeks, he said.
Okay. So, all right. Well, then that could be right. That could be right.
Right. And that's why I was told that that by Frost that he remembers around that period her being at the house, where at Planup's house, it almost seeming like she had spent a few nights there. Like it seems like she was jumping around in that time period.
Yeah, that wouldn't shock me.
Right. So that part, that's what that seemed like. So okay, so I understand kind of what they're thinking about with Bryce. I understand with Trudy. I understand with Planup and Akers. Were there anyone else that jumps to the fore, or were they all like lower than that?
Oh God, there was another Dave
Corbin.
Dave Corbin. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I say, at one point there was this whole handful of potential suspects. By the same token, as you might imagine, you prioritize,
right?
And some of these guys were, he's a possibility. We'll not forget about him. As I recall that, I seem to recall that thinking about Corbin, that he was a possibility. We're not going to dismiss him. We're not going to clear him, but he really doesn't look like as good a suspect as some of these others.
Okay. So let's talk about Chuck Smith for a minute. If you remember, he was the sighting at the Cocaline gas station. So first of all, you're understanding that a sighting occurred right the Sunday before she went missing.
Well, I think there was some debate about that.
Okay.
Whether that was actually just the day before or the weekend before.
Right. I wondered about that.
I mean, I don't think there was any question that Chuck probably saw what he saw, but I let's put it this way, our confidence was not 100% that he accurately remembered
what day,
what day it was. We know it had to either be just that, like I say, the day before or whatever it was, or the weekend before. We're sure of that.
Okay.
But to be able to say it was definitely the day before, I don't think we ever determined that 100%.
And do you know if John Munden, I know he showed pictures to him. Do you know if he showed Ricky Akers' picture and David Planup's pictures to him?
I don't know, but I'm relatively sure that John showed him pictures of everybody he could think of who was connected.
Okay.
And to my recollection, Chuck wasn't able to identify anybody, from that.
And he knew he used to work for the Snedeker's, so he would know people that worked there too. He would know certain people.
Should.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he should have. Now, it had been a little while, I think, since he worked for them. But yes, he had been a driver,
right,
for him. And I'm not 100% sure that Chuck wasn't one of the drivers that ended up giving John some information about some of the illegal shit they did with their waste oil.
That would be leading to my next question, because it was some months later that Trudy started sniffing around John for the phone number. Right? And so she had said, don't tell Steve I'm asking, which that I'm not sure if she actually didn't want Steve to know she was doing that, or she was just saying that and Steve was the one who had asked her to go do this in the first place. Did you have any feeling about that?
Well, again, it's one of those things where everybody lies.
Yeah.
And everybody lies about everything, and everybody lies about things they don't even have to lie about. So, you could never be sure. I think John pretty much took her at her word on that she just didn't want Steve to know, but he could never be sure.
Because then I'm asking myself, if that's the case, let's roll with that for a minute. She's trying to get his number, and eventually he goes missing. So are we to assume that she's responsible for Chuck Smith going missing, separate and apart from Steve altogether in that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So that says something very interesting about Trudy, in that she has a lot of the same instincts as her husband then.
Yep.
Wow. That
I think there were at least 4 or 5 people who died or disappeared connecting to this, and I think 2 or 3 of them were Trudy and 2 or 3 of them were Steve, and I don't think one knew about the other until the very end, and that's what led to Trudy's demise.
You're kidding. So which ones would you attribute possibly to other ones besides Chuck to Trudy?
Well, Lora.
Okay, right.
There's Lora, and then there's Chuck, and then you've got to look at Steve when it comes to the guy.
Lambert, the guy.
Lambert,
okay.
Yeah, Tony Lambert. Thank you. Looking at Tony Lambert, and I think he eventually did Trudy in.
Right, and then there was that James Wilkes, who is sort of the one that there's not much information about.
No, there's not, and so he was just kind of on the periphery. We knew about him, we knew his name, we knew that there was a question that he was gone, but nobody really was ever able to best of my knowledge, ever able to put him directly in connection to the rest of these disappearances. It's possible,
right?
It's possible. But I think Trudy. You can lay Lora and Chuck Smith at Trudy's feet, and Lambert and Trudy at Steve's.
So Chuck saying things, possibly being one of the truck drivers that Munden talked to and giving them information, but also in one of Brenda's later Florida reports, when she started really talking, she said that her opinion was, and you have to take this with a grain of salt as anything else, but that Chuck Smith may have said things to police about her sister's sexual proclivities and drugs, and that's why her father, she thought it was her father that got rid of him, may have had something to do with Chuck. So that's why I had asked you earlier about, would they be killing people off simply because they're besmirching the reputation of their daughter? I find that 100% impossible to believe. Well, let's put it this way. Is there any chance at all something like that happened? I suppose you have to be honest and say, well, I guess it could have. Right.
But I don't think anybody, John or I or any of the, as we called them, the Lora Morris Study Group that met numerous times, ever believed that there was anything to that other than something Chuck Smith saw or said put Trudy in jeopardy.
And, so Danny's theory was basically he thinks Steve was behind them all, and that although he did say probably Trudy was, I just have a hard time. Who is she? What is she doing? Has she got her own hitman on the side that she's calling and saying, get rid of this guy?
Well, you don't know. The point is they were both, hip deep in this shady oil business. They were both no strangers to breaking the law.
Yeah.
And when there's the old saying, when you lay down with dogs, you get up with fleas.
Right.
The Chuck Smith thing seemed to be Trudy, all along. I mean, it was Trudy who fished for his number with John. It was Trudy, I think, as I recall, who ended up talking to Chuck about the potential for a job down in Tennessee or wherever it was. I mean, I can't see Steve orchestrating, a situation where he was just getting his wife to call all these people.
What do you know about any polygraphs that Steve or Trudy took? If they did.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember whether they ever did or not. I know. John took a polygraph examiner. I want to say from the state police, maybe a retired examiner, up to Bryce's at one point. And it was weird. John said, because when they got there, they went in the house and Bryce was sitting at, like, I want to say the dining room table, and had his priest there. And it was just, John said the whole thing just was very strange.
Bryce had a priest?
Apparently did, or had a minister or something of some kind. A man of the cloth was there with him at the house when the cops showed up to give him a polygraph, I'm pretty sure.
Did he take a polygraph?
I want to say, I'm thinking for some reason the whole thing went south.
Yeah, somehow.
And I'm not sure what the circumstances were, but I don't think it actually happened. And I think there was some reason whether it was he refused to do it after they got up there, or the polygraph examiner said, listen, this guy is so shook up, I'm not going to be able to get a reading on him. I don't know. But I want to say it did go south for some reason.
Yeah, I believe in the debrief. I'd have to go back and look it up, but I believe when they were asking him if anybody refused a polygraph, he said no, and then he doubled back when they got to Bryce, and he said he didn't take the polygraph. So I think you're right. I think something happened there with that.
But I remember John more than once just telling me about how bizarre that whole thing was to find them sitting in the dining room at the table, him and his minister. It
strikes me as odd that he would have had a priest. Now, I have spoken with Bryce's mother. I interviewed her, and she was very gracious. She told me everything she remembered. Maybe she had a priest, but I can't imagine Bryce even going to church. Like, what,
And it could be. I mean, that was just the way John phrased it to me. It could have been the family minister. It could have been her mom's or her. I don't know.
I'm gonna have
the minister was there because of what was going on with Bryce and the cops and the polygraph.
So the cornfield where Lora was found about 8 months after she was missing. First of all, were there any links to any of the players involved in that cornfield?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, and then
it was just across the county line.
Right.
And the guy, the hired hand, or the guy that farmed that ground with the owner, I guess, or for the owner, is the one who discovered the body. And he called police, and so, but I don't know of anybody who had any connection that I'm aware of to that location. It was a couple of miles north of a little tiny burg. Absolutely in the middle of the country on a road that wouldn't be traveled very often.
Okay.
So it very easily could have just been somebody driving around trying to get out in the middle of the boonies and finally found a spot and said, okay, this is good enough.
Did it seem like they would have had to get out of the car and carry her in? They mentioned a fence. Yeah. They couldn't have driven in then.
No, I don't think so. No, because even if they could pull off the road, now there was as I recall, there was an area that would have been drivable along the side of the fence. There was a fence on the road. Okay, there was a fence on the road, and then you could pull off into the field. There was a little, like an opening in the fence where, like farmers would take their tractors and stuff through.
Right, a little 2-track or something.
Yeah. It was just a grassy. It wasn't paved or anything. And there was a place, depending on the weather, that, you could have probably driven up through there. But there was also a fence that ran perpendicular to the road, okay? And so they could have driven up on the east side of the fence, but the body was probably, 30 yards or so west of that dividing fence. So even if they drove into the adjacent field, they still had to get the body over the fence and carry it that distance over into the other field.
Okay, that was what I was wondering about.
It wasn't right along the fence row or anything like that. It wasn't too far, but I'd say probably 30 yards, maybe 50 yards tops.
Okay. I wanted to know about, with relation to the psychics, because there was also a barn that they were led to, right? A barn with some stolen items that were found. Did they ever link those stolen items in the barn to Planep or Acres or any of those guys?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
All right.
Yeah, it was referred to in generic terms as the party barn around here. So apparently it was a place that a lot of people would go and drink or do drugs or have moments alone or whatever. But I think it was just kind of an abandoned barn on a country road where the house, I think, had long since been gone. Okay,
and no indication that Lora positively had ever been there.
I don't know that. I mean, there was no direct evidence.
Okay.
That she'd ever been there. I mean, nothing that was found there ever belonged to her, as far as I know.
Okay.
Or nothing that directly tied her to having been there. Although I think it was probably not a huge jump to expect that it's entirely possible she could have been there with some of the wild folks that she was running with.
And did they ever connect any of those other people that she was running with to that barn? Or it's just, it was I don't...
I don't know.
Okay.
I have to just be honest with you and say I don't know.
Right.
I don't think anybody was ever charged or arrested for anything in connection to whatever they found at the barn.
Okay. But it was the newspaper did say that the things that were stolen in that barn were tracked down to a robbery that had occurred just prior to Lora going missing, maybe the night before or something like that.
Okay.
So I wondered if that was ever, linked to one, because we got some robbers in this case, unfortunately.
Yeah. No question. And to be honest with you, I just don't remember, Jenny.
Okay. That may be something I can try to track down and find out.
Yeah, I just don't remember. The only thing I can tell you is that I don't remember anybody connected to this case being charged or arrested or whatever for anything having to do with the barn.
Yeah, and it seems to me like if they put Acres and him in that barn, you probably would know that. You know what I mean? Like, that would have been something Munden would have been discussing with you, like...
Well, sure.
Right?
Sure,
I mean...
Sure.
And that never came up in your study group, like...
No, there was very little, I think, and I'm 99% sure of this, there was very little, within just a couple of months after the disappearance, there was very little about the case that John was not willing to share with me.
Yeah, it seems like if it was big enough to connect some of your suspects with, I feel like I'll probably learn that there wasn't any connection, but it's something I'll check into.
Sure.
So the Planep thing is interesting to me only because to me he looks like him and Acres have the most circumstantial evidence against them aside from Trudy. Those would be my ones that I thought, and Bryce, I guess you're right with Bryce. So those are the top ones, and I guess I'm I just don't. I do know that Acres was raping in the area because I have a couple firm dates in that time.
Yeah.
So, but other than those witness statements, there wasn't anything to link him, either one of them. And then, of course, they're both dead, so there's no way to find anything out.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing that kept coming back to us as the study group was involved is, okay, all right, how does that what does that have to do with Chuck Smith? If it was Akers or Atlanta, how does that explain Chuck Smith?
Well, and here's my thought on that. Let's say if we don't think it's Trudy for a minute, because I have a question right now of whether it's Trudy. I'm still on the fence. If it wasn't Trudy, and it's actually, to be honest, due to something that Danny said. He had an epiphany. We had talked many times. He said, I think to figure out who killed Lora, you have to take that situation and set it aside from everything else that happened afterwards, because that confuses the issue. Let's look at Lora herself and see what happened and see, and of course they're all related because one thing sent the other ones. But what if in fact Gertrude didn't go? What if it was Steve that said, Gertrude, get his number. I want to go shake him down next. I want to find out what Chuck Smith knows or what he said about my daughter. What if it wasn't Trudy that initiated that? What if it was Steve telling her to do it? And that would be my question about that.
I understand. I guess I would respond. I think John would respond and say, well, then why didn't Steve do it? He and I were on as good a terms as I was with Trudy. Why didn't Steve ask me?
Yeah, and it would, I guess the question would be, what was Steve feeling already under pressure because he'd already dispatched with one person? He'd already gotten rid of Lambert. I mean, how shady is it going to look if he goes to get rid? Someone else disappears if he's the one that's asking about him, and then he goes missing.
Well, and that's true. Other than I'm not sure if it's going to look bad. I don't think it makes, to my mind anyway, it doesn't make much difference whether it's Steve or Trudy.
Or Trudy, you're right. That's true. That's true.
If you're worried about, if it still comes back to the Snediger family.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And it comes back to Steve and Trudy. So, I don't know. It was just, like I say, we just kept thinking about, there has to be a theory that makes everything fall into place. And
that's the thing. If you're trying to put it all together, it does make sense. But if, in fact, it's Lora's separate and it had nothing to do with Trudy and it was just these two guys that were druggies were going to come rob the place and they grabbed her or whatever, then you wouldn't expect everything thereafter to attach to it because it wasn't related. It was something totally separate. So I think you have to look at it both ways and try to analyze it. Like you said, either it's one of these or the other. And if it's the latter, then the things that happened afterwards do not need to be related at all. But then,
well, I guess I just, and I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I find it a little incredulous, not impossible, but a little hard to believe that the one night that Trudy was at the home on Shadeland Drive and Lora disappears after months of her not being here. She's there one night, something happens to Lora, and that just happens to be the night that one of these other buttheads decide they're going to attack the house.
Well, that's true, but I have thought about that a little. I'm going to share what you see what you think. So she was dating that guy Winston for about the few days leading up. There's only one night in there that he did not spend the night, and that was Saturday. But he spent most of the night there. Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and then I believe Sunday night. So that would mean his car was in the driveway all of those nights. So if those knuckleheads did come to try to rob the place, they'd see there was actually another vehicle besides hers in the driveway, except Saturday night. I'll give you that. So maybe they were casing the place and they came and did something on the first night that no one else's car was there. And that was when Trudy was there. So, like I said, right now I don't really know, but that's where my head is at, and that's why I wanted to talk to you because you guys already went through all these scenarios in your head.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think we just came to the conclusion after looking at everything that there was no Chuck Smith was so far down the ladder in terms of suspects or even in terms of Steve and Trudy, I think, at least at that time, that it just doesn't. If Lora's death was an isolated incident and unrelated, it just does not explain, to our view, Chuck Smith.
Yeah, and I agree with you there, because Chuck Smith happened a few months later. So it's like, why are they doing it? And the only thing that would, and even Danny said, the only thing that would make sense is that if they were just shaking down Chuck like they were shaking down everyone else. And for example, if Chuck had been saying stuff in his talking to police about the business, that may be another, that's the other thing I keep trying to remind myself. Steve's reason for doing things might not always be related to Lora. If if police are talking to all these people and they have information, it could be self-interest in some situations. It may not just be him beating people up trying to find out if they killed, his daughter.
Right. And I understand.
Yeah.
I understand that. I don't know. Like I say, we spent hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours going over what we thought was every conceivable scenario, and that's just, that theory is what we came up with.
Yeah.
As what just really sort of fit and made everything. I guess my other thought, is old man Romans in that phone call.
Yeah, that's a problem. That is, if they definitely dated that, then that's a problem too. You're right.
I'm not so sure, and I think most all of us agreed after we found out that little tidbit of information that, number one, he didn't say, well, okay, listen, if Trudy had just called and said, listen, Laura's not here. I don't know where she went. I'm afraid something's happened to her. Could you come? He would have said, well, sure, Trudy, if you really need me. And okay, well, all right, well, I'll head over that way. I don't think there would have been the urgency on his part. Number two, there would have been no reason for him to have left his nurse at the hotel.
Right. If it was a mistaken dates and he was going over to find out if Laura's already missing, you'd think that they'd bring the nurse over there. There'd
be no reason to leave her. The only reason that makes sense to me is that he didn't want her to know whatever was going on at the house. So he sticks her in a hotel.
Yeah, I see why they came to that conclusion. Yeah.
The hotel isn't but 3 miles from the house. And
John spoke to her, I imagine, right? John spoke to and what did she say, the nurse?
Sure, I know he did. The nurse, you mean?
And the nurse.
The nurse you're talking about?
The nurse that he ended up marrying, right?
Yeah. Well, whatever their arrangement was.
Yeah.
He talked to her, and she confirmed that he came over there and dropped her off at it was a little seedy hotel, really, a motel actually, and was gone a couple hours and came back and got her, and they went straight. They didn't stop go. They didn't, they went straight home to Florida.
And now that you're saying that, if in fact this occurred after, like in my original question, well, what if they're wrong about the date and it was just the next day Trudy calling and saying, Laura's missing, police are here, we can't find her, and they ran into town, they probably wouldn't have left that fast. They probably would have stayed for a little while. Yeah.
That's exactly my thought. There would have been no urgency on old man Roman's part to get there to just say, listen, we're going now. Get your stuff.
And then to go right back home so fast, they probably would have stayed around as moral support. And I believe, they did come back. That's the thing, though. They did come back later after she was notified. They came back to town at some point when she started telling family members. Buck and June were there. There were a bunch of people that showed up.
Yeah, eventually they had a crowd.
Yeah.
But that, like I say, when you look at that phone call, and the people who they were staying with swear to God it was that same day, and then you look at Roman's behavior and what he did with the nurse, and then his trip straight home, just like, I want to get the hell out of Dodge. It just doesn't make sense that it was a different timeline.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I totally see now why that was the theory.
As we're talking about circumstantial evidence, we know Trudy carried a .25. It was they were .25 caliber bullets that were found.
Right.
Now, that's small small thing. There's lots of cheap 25s around,
Mm-hmm.
but to know that, it wasn't like she was found in the field with 38s through her head, and Trudy carries a 25. No, they were all 25s.
And the other thing you have to think about in that case is, like you were talking about, well, we wouldn't know if she was shot in the soft tissue. But the 3 bullets to her head look like the kind of shots that you shoot at someone. They're all in the same area, right on the side of the head, right? Shot at one, if that happened afterwards in the field, then that means she handed her dad her gun and said, shoot her in the head or whatever. There was a plan. I mean, that's pretty, that's awful.
Cover it up. I mean, it's all about trying to cover it up.
Yeah, and that means...
And the thing is, they were so deep in illegal shit that they could not afford to just call the police in and tell them what happened. It was an accident, we got in a fight, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And because all of a sudden, that investigation gets real deep and into their background and into Trudy and into Steve and into their business. And then, prosecutors are going to want to know all that stuff. And I think they just wanted to stay as far away from law enforcement as they could, and found themselves in a situation where, oh shit, we'd like to never have any connection to police officers ever anywhere, but we're in a situation now we got no choice.
And then they made it worse because they kept killing people.
Yeah, well, of course,
I mean,
but,
it's crazy. Yeah. Well, is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you think is important for me to know, as far as any, major thing that I missed, as far, that you can think of at this time?
Well, I mean, it's obvious you've done a lot of research and a lot of homework, because there's a lot of stuff that you already know, about that. And hopefully I was able to put a little of it in perspective.
You have a lot, yes.
And as far as the major players were concerned, I think, to the best of my recollection, it's pretty well covered. I do think it was important that apparently you had not heard the story about Trudy shooting in the side yard.
No, and that is very compelling, because she shouldn't have known how Lora was injured. So that would be something that a prosecutor would definitely hit on in a trial.
Sure, of course. I mean, when you start just adding everything up, it's hard to make a leap that Trudy was not somehow involved. And the sad part is, like I say, I think what really cemented that, I think we believe that Trudy was probably involved for a good period of time, but what really cemented it, I think, was the trip that we made to Ohio, talking to the relatives, and the story about her dad leaving in such a almost panicked hurry, running to Greenfield, dropping the nurse off, going to the house, we assume, going back and picking her up, and not stopping at the house again, just going straight to Florida. And on the same morning that she disappeared. That, I think that, for us, I think was kind of the icing on the cake that said, well, if that's true, and they swore it was, that's got to be the story. That's got to be what happened.
Yeah, and she's deceased now, so I can't talk to her, dang it, because that would have been interesting. What I would ask her is, when he came back to the hotel, what condition was he in? What did his clothes look like? Well, if he dumped a body, something's going on there,
Sure.
Yeah.
It was. The other thing, I guess, just as I look back on the years that I spent as a journalist and an editor, there's a difference between. Sometimes there's a difference between facts, what's true and what's accurate. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Everything can be accurate sometimes in a story, but sometimes, depending on how it's written, the story isn't really true. I know it's hard to describe, but I was always very careful that I didn't let any of the reporters take a slant. If they had a fact, we did not. We all know, if you want to slant a story, you don't do it by what you say, you do it by what you don't say.
Right. And if you're cherry picking facts and only putting some of them out there.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's what you choose not to report.
Right.
That slants the story.
Yeah.
And I was just always very extra careful to not let that happen, so that if we reported something that to the best of our ability, it was not only accurate, but true. So, I mean, I figured that out pretty quick.
I want to thank Dave Scott so much for taking the time to speak with me. We spoke for hours, and he was a fantastic resource on this case. In the next episode, as promised, you will finally get to hear John Munden's theories in his own words. Stay tuned.